Reaching the end of a job interview, an HR recruiter asked a young accountant who was fresh out of school, "What starting salary would you like to make?" The new accountant said, "I'd like to make in the neighborhood of $250,000 a year just to start, depending on the benefits package, of course, and I'd like to be making $1 million within 5 years, by the time I'm about 26 years old." Well, the interviewer responded, "Okay, what would you say about a package of 5 weeks vacation, full medical and dental? The company is going to take 50% of your salary value and put that in an IRA. We'll give you profit sharing, and we're going to lease you a new BMW. Would that work for you?" The young accountant sat up and said, "Wow, are you joking?" And the interviewer replied, "Yes, but you started it." Now, we may at times wonder about Jesus' resurrection, about how he rose from the dead and won new life for us. New life when we die, and new life with our ability to start over this morning and each and every morning. We may wonder if, like with that person coming out of school, if it's all a big joke or a big misunderstanding. And you know what? It is okay to ask those questions. We are not bad people when we wrestle with faith. We're not bad people to wonder about evidence. Even though Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have seen, or who believe without seeing," there is evidence to this story being true. That's why we're starting the 6-week series called How Do We Know It's True? There is evidence, strong evidence, that Jesus is who he claimed to be, and strong evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And putting all that evidence together over these 6 weeks paints a picture of a world-changing event that really happened. So today we're focusing on Jesus' tomb and how it was empty. And in later weeks, we'll talk about evidence that his followers did not steal his body. We'll talk about evidence that his followers were telling the truth, even giving their lives for this truth. But today, the first evidence that Jesus' tomb is empty, and this is sermon note number 1, everyone alive at the time agreed Jesus' tomb was empty. So you might hear an author now say, well, maybe he was thrown in some other, like a mass grave with prisoners or whatever, but everybody then knew the tomb was empty. Jesus' followers obviously believed the tomb was empty. I mean, that's a no-brainer. And yes, they were witnesses to the empty tomb. Although, if we're going to be intellectually honest, we have to concede they wanted the tomb to be empty because they wanted Jesus to be alive. So their testimony alone, it's valid, it's important, it's verifiable, but it's not as strong as another group of people's testimony that the tomb was empty. Who were those people? Jesus' enemies. Jesus' opponents also knew and claimed that Jesus' tomb was empty. They're hostile witnesses, and they're saying it's empty. The fact that people who opposed Jesus and later opposed the task of the early church, the fact that these enemies of Jesus agreed the tomb was empty is even stronger support. Because if his tomb was not empty, the political leaders and the religious leaders who despised him and who despised the church would have simply said, "Hey, Jesus' tomb is over there. Go look for the body yourself." But they did not do that because there was no body remaining in the tomb. In fact, we hear these opponents of Jesus concoct a lie that his followers stole the body, and they even bribed people. Matthew 28, 11 through 15, which is now on your screen, and it's also in your sermon note sheet. That is tiny letters, so maybe look at your sermon note sheet and you'll be able to read it, or here we go. It says, "While they were going, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, 'You must say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this comes to the governor's ear, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So they took the money and did as they were directed, And the story is still told among the Jews to this day. Now, that would have been the people of the day, maybe about 30 or 40 years later on. So the guards went along with the conspiracy. Why? Well, the Roman guards would be executed for abandoning a post. And not just that, their families also got executed if the guards abandoned the posts. Now, we don't know what happened to the guards or to their families, if they were ever punished or whatever, but we do know the guards took part in a conspiracy claiming the body was stolen, even though it would not have been possible for people to sneak past Roman guards who were watching 24/7, to go past Roman guards who were some of the strongest and bravest people in the world at that time and had the threat of execution hanging over them and their families. Plus, a humongous stone was rolled in front of the tomb, which took multiple incredibly strong Roman soldiers to move into place. The whole reason a large stone was placed in front of the tomb, the whole reason for the guard in the first place, is that those religious and political leaders were afraid someone would steal Jesus' body and claim he rose from the dead. In other words, they were on the lookout for this exact thing that eventually they realized happened. The tomb is empty. Now, of course, in the coming weeks, again, we're going to dive into how we know the body wasn't stolen. But for now, there is tremendous irony in how all of Jesus' enemies tried to cover up his resurrection, and yet not a single one of them claimed that the body was still in the tomb. Maybe even more ironic is how his opponents seemed to have at first more faith in the empty tomb than even his own followers had. So again, over these 6 weeks, we'll get into details about why his body wasn't stolen, but for the sake of today, the religious leaders and the Roman authorities and Jesus' followers all agreed there was no body and the tomb was empty, period. No one alive at the time claimed otherwise. A second piece of evidence that the tomb is empty is Jesus' tomb did not become a shrine. Yes, there is now a church at that site, and that church, it took hundreds of years for somebody to decide to put a church at that site, and that hundreds of years, that's a big part of this, because you see, very often when a holy person dies, or even a very unholy person dies, those closest to the person go and visit the grave. They go and visit the grave and they set up a shrine for the person. We have presidential libraries and museums where some presidents and spouses are buried. Napoleon's tomb in Paris draws huge crowds, and it's great for the economy. St. Paul, who was killed for following Jesus, is buried at a church in Rome. Well, except for his head, which is buried at a different church because he was beheaded, but still, his body was buried, and people immediately started visiting Paul's burial site after his death. And you know what else they did? They turned it into a shrine because his body was there. This is the reason President Obama made the decision to bury Osama bin Laden at sea after SEAL Team 6 did their work. He was buried at sea so nobody could set up a shrine and go visit it. When Jesus died, there were about 50 shrines in and around Jerusalem at the tombs of famous people, even controversial people. But the early followers of Jesus did not make a shrine at his tomb because the body was not there. A third piece of evidence that the tomb is empty and the story is true is that the first witnesses to the empty tomb were women. Now, this is a sad reality, but during Jesus' time, women were not allowed to testify in most court situations because they were not considered reliable witnesses. Now, this is horrible. This just grates at our ears today, but we remember we still have phrases like old wives' tales that come from that same attitude. The male guards, and they were all male, the Roman guards, these male guards, who later took part in a deception about the body being stolen, would have had far greater legal standing than these women at the empty tomb. However, women who could not legally be witnesses, were the first witnesses to the empty tomb. And, later on, to Jesus walking and talking and being alive from the dead. They were the first ones. Now, since women held less credibility in the Roman world of 2,000 years ago, and their testimony in court rarely had standing, why did God choose women to be the first witnesses? It happened precisely so that we would know the story is true. It happened precisely so we know the tomb would be empty. If somebody were making up this story about an empty tomb, if somebody decided to write a fairy tale about a rabbi rising from the dead, this is the opposite way they would have done it. They never would have done it this way. If somebody were making up this story, the first witnesses at the tomb would have been Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. The first witnesses would have included the high priest, Caiaphas. The first witnesses would have been famous scholars and writers at the time like Seneca and Gamaliel or Josephus or Aristocles or Philo of Alexandria. But they were not the first eyewitnesses. Instead, it was women whose testimony would have been barred from a court of law. God used the worst legal witnesses as testimony to the fact that Jesus' tomb was empty and the resurrection really happened. And this is exactly what gives us hope this morning. Because here's the other thing. God uses unlikely witnesses today to this same truth, that Jesus is risen from the dead and gives us power through new life. And how do we know? We can look around us. God uses people whose lives have completely fallen apart and transforms them into solid, dependable people through the power of Jesus' resurrection. God uses people who are on the brink of giving up on this life and transforms them with a solid hope that spurs them into meaningful and abundant life through the power of Jesus' resurrection. God uses people who have been ignored and forgotten and marginalized by the world and transforms them into influential voices who change the world for the better through the power of Jesus' resurrection. God still uses unlikely witnesses to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and that we too can experience new life right here and right now. This promise is also for you and for me. So our last note, we don't have to wait until we die to experience the power of Jesus' life for us. New life through Jesus Christ is available right now and is waiting for us to embrace it. Amen.